Welcome to The Explainer. I am so glad you're here with us. Today, we're tackling a truly fascinating subject. We're demystifying the boundaries and the really interesting connections between three specific neurodivergent profiles: social communication disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD. You know, if you've ever found yourself wondering where one of these conditions ends and another begins, or why certain traits just seem to show up across the board, you are in the exact right place. We're going to break this down using some incredibly helpful visual mapping to make these complex clinical definitions crystal clear. Okay, let's dive into this. To really untangle these interwoven profiles, we're going to navigate a complex neurodiversity map. Over the next few minutes, we'll essentially work from the outside in. We'll define the unique pillars of social communication disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD, and then we'll explore those fascinating overlapping spaces where these traits blur together into a unified core. So here is our roadmap for today. First, three distinct neurodivergent profiles. Second, where the conditions overlap. Third, core shared intersecting challenges. And finally, number 4, understanding unique individual profiles. All right, section 1. Three distinct neurodivergent profiles. Establishing the pillars. Before we can really understand how these conditions interact, we absolutely have to establish our foundational baselines. Our first pillar is social communication disorder, or SCD for short. Now, what's really interesting about this is how heavily it focuses on the practical application of language. This isn't necessarily about a lack of vocabulary or, an inability to form sentences. It's about the pragmatics of social speech. It's the difference between knowing the dictionary definition of the word fine and knowing what a teenager actually means when they sigh, roll their eyes, and say, I'm fine, right? It's the trouble with navigating changing talking styles depending on whether you're speaking to a teacher versus a best friend, or having the narrative flow to effectively tell a story. Let's break down what those conversational hurdles actually look like in practice. Individuals with SCD often really struggle with understanding those unspoken social rules that a lot of us just take for granted. Following the natural rhythm of a conversation can be incredibly difficult, and eye contact might be atypical. Think about the real-world example of taking turns in a conversation. For someone with SCD, figuring out exactly when the other person is finished speaking or when it's socially appropriate to jump in, it just isn't intuitive. It can make everyday social interactions feel like trying to jump into a fast-moving game of double Dutch jump rope without actually knowing the rhythm. To ground these clinical terms even further, let's look at a specific example from our source material: misinterpreting as a joke. Imagine missing the subtle cues of sarcasm, tone, or context and misinterpreting a completely serious comment as a joke, or vice versa. You can easily see how struggling to read the room in this way could lead to some real social friction or feelings of isolation, even if the person's intent was completely friendly from the start. Okay, now let's establish our second pillar, up at the top of our map: autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. While ASD absolutely involves persistent deficits in social communication and interaction, which we're actually going to compare to SCD in just a moment, it is uniquely marked by restricted and repetitive patterns. This is a defining difference. ASD often involves a strong need for strict routine, engaging in repetitive motions, and having an intense, deep focus on specific interests. Plus, individuals with ASD frequently experience significant sensory sensitivities. And this is really important to note. ASD may or may not affect an individual's intellect. It is a remarkably broad and diverse spectrum. Moving over to the final pillar on the right, we have ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit/Hyperactivity Disorder. ADHD is distinctly characterized by its primary drivers: inattention and hyperactivity. This manifests as difficulty staying focused, struggling to listen or follow through on multi-step instructions, and experiencing internal or external restlessness and fidgeting. It also involves impulsivity, disorganization, forgetfulness, and conversational challenges like interrupting others or talking excessively. It's kind of like the engine is running super fast, but the brakes and steering are having a really hard time keeping up. Section 2, where the conditions overlap. Blurring the lines. Let's move to and see how this builds. Now that we have our independent pillars, let's look at where the diagnostic lines actually begin to blur. Looking at the overlap between social communication disorder and autism spectrum disorder, what do they actually have in common? Well, both share distinct deficits in social communication, which result in atypical social interactions. An individual with either diagnosis might really struggle with the back and forth of conversation. However, the key differentiator remains those repetitive patterns and restricted interests we talked about a minute ago. ASD requires those patterns for diagnosis, SCD doesn't. Next, looking at the intersection between autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, there is a surprising amount of shared territory here. In this overlapping space, we see that both profiles can actually feature hyperactivity and inattention. Both groups often experience significant difficulty with transitions, moving from one activity or environment to another. They both also frequently share sensory processing challenges and deep struggles with executive function. And this brilliantly brings that sensory processing overlap to life. Our source material highlights the example of a child covering their ears in response to a loud school bell. This is a classic sensory challenge. A loud, unexpected noise isn't just annoying for them, it can be physically painful or completely overwhelming. Because both ASD and ADHD can involve sensory sensitivities and difficulties filtering out environmental stimuli, this exact same reaction could be seen in a child with either profile. It's a perfectly shared experience. Finally, looking at our last two-way intersection, social communication disorder and ADHD. Now, these might seem very different on the surface, but they share a major conversational overlap. Both can involve impulsive behavior in conversations, such as interrupting the speaker, and a shared struggle to pay attention to critical social cues. Here is a perfect classroom anecdote to illustrate that. A student who calls out in class without raising their hand. From the outside, looking in, this behavior looks identical, but the internal driver might be completely different. A child with SAD might call out because they genuinely missed the social cue or the unspoken rule that you must raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. A child with ADHD, on the other hand, might know that rule perfectly well, but their impulsivity causes them to blurt out the answer before their brain can engage the brakes to raise their hand. Identical outward behavior, overlapping traits, but totally different root causes. Wild, right? Okay, section 3. Core, shared, intersecting challenges. Let's move to the very center of the map. So, what are the universal challenges that link all three of these distinct profiles together? So the crucial point is that despite their vast differences, SD, ASD, and ADHD share these deep foundational struggles at the very core. First up, executive function challenges. This means universal struggles with the brain's management system, planning, organizing, remembering instructions, and executing tasks. Second, emotional regulation issues. There are shared difficulties in managing, processing, and appropriately responding to intense emotional experiences. And third, and honestly perhaps most importantly, a uniquely shared way of processing the world. All three of these profiles represent brains that take in, filter, and interpret their surrounding environments in fundamentally different ways than neurotypical brains do. And finally, section 4, understanding unique individual profiles. When we pull back and look at the holistic message here, you can see how beautifully complex this whole territory is. The labels, SCD, ASD, ADHD, they are incredibly useful to help clinicians, teachers, and individuals map the territory, find the right vocabulary, and access resources. But the ultimate goal, as the foundation of our map states, is understanding each individual's unique profile. Nobody fits perfectly into just one neat little box without spilling over the edges. Recognizing the unique blend of traits, the specific overlaps, and the core processing differences in every single person is really what truly matters. I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. How does understanding these uniquely overlapping neurodivergent profiles change how we actually support the individuals in our lives? When we stop looking just at the outward behavior, like interrupting or covering ears, and start understanding the complex intersections of social deficits, executive function challenges, and sensory processing underneath all of that, it completely transforms our approach from one of correction to one of deep empathy and effective support. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time on The Explainer.